He was a tired, overlooked CIA officer drowning in debt, alcohol, and frustration, until one decision turned him into the most devastating traitor in American intelligence history. That one choice would help get at least 10 American sources executed, tear apart entire CIA networks inside the Soviet Union, and humiliate US intelligence in front of the world. If you're fascinated by real Cold War spy stories like this, make sure to subscribe and tell me in the comments. Do you think Aldrich Ames was driven more by greed or resentment? Aldrich Ames did not begin life as a shadowy figure moving through alleys and exchanging secrets in hushed whispers. He was born in River Falls, Wisconsin, in 1941. An ordinary American child in an ordinary Midwestern town, the kind of place where betrayal and treason seemed as distant as another planet. His parents, Carlton and Rachel, shaped a quiet, bookish boy surrounded by words, ideas, and expectations. His father would become the defining influence in his life. Carlton Ames joined the Central Intelligence Agency when Aldrich was still young, uprooting the family and pulling them into the orbit of a world where truth was negotiable, loyalties were fluid, and secrecy was a way of life. Dinner conversations were careful, friends were monitored, trust was conditional. For young Aldrich, secrecy didn't feel dangerous, it felt normal. He grew up in the shadow of a man who served a powerful, mysterious government machine while simultaneously struggling with his own personal demons. Carlton was respected, but flawed, brilliant, yet weakened by alcohol and disappointment. Aldrich watched a man who had given his life to the CIA slowly unravel, professionally sidelined and emotionally worn down. It was an early lesson Aldrich would carry with him. The agency could make you, and it could quietly crush you. The institution was everything, until it decided you weren't worth much anymore. Aldrich's first contact with the CIA came shockingly early. As a teenager, he found himself working summers inside the same organization that defined his household, filing records, walking government hallways most people only read about. For most, this would have been the height of pride, a dream fulfilled before adulthood. For Ames, it was simply life continuing on a track laid out before he was capable of choosing another. He slipped into intelligence work not as a heroic calling, but as an inheritance. He was not charismatic, he was not fearless, he was quiet, introspective, slightly awkward, a man who seemed perpetually unsure whether he belonged anywhere at all. Yet beneath that quiet exterior lingered something else, a subtle dissatisfaction, a sense of being overlooked, a quiet simmer of resentment. In that stillness, hidden far beneath the surface, the earliest cracks were already forming. Cracks that someday the entire American intelligence community would pay for. By the time Aldrich Ames truly settled into his CIA career, the sheen of mystery and purpose that once surrounded the agency had begun to fade. What should have been a life of high-stakes operations and patriotic purpose increasingly felt like a job, mundane, frustrating, and deeply unfulfilling. His early assignments showed promise on paper. He worked Soviet targets, traveled abroad, and handled real intelligence. But beneath the surface, something was already going wrong. In Turkey, he performed adequately, but just adequately. Assessments described him as capable yet uninspired, intelligent but disinterested. He wasn't the dynamic field officer the CIA liked to imagine itself built upon. He was average, and Ames hated that. Alcohol soon became a constant companion. What began as social drinking drifted into dependence, dulling the edges of his disappointment. He developed a reputation for long lunches that blurred into afternoons, arguments fueled by too many glasses, and a consistent inability to care deeply about the responsibilities placed in his hands. The CIA noticed. His file recorded security violations, carelessness with classified material, and a troubling lack of discipline. One particularly alarming incident saw him leave a briefcase full of sensitive documents unattended on public transportation, an unforgivable sin in the world he lived in. Yet the agency, comfortable in its bureaucracy, shuffled him along instead of stopping him. Assignments came and went. New York, Mexico City, Washington again. Each move promised opportunity. Each ended in mediocrity. His Spanish never improved. His performance never sharpened. His reputation as a drinker and a man whose ambition lacked momentum grew stronger than any reputation for excellence. He was surrounded by colleagues who seemed more charismatic, more valued, more trusted. He had entered a world defined by secrets and power, but found himself perpetually stuck beneath the surface of greatness. Over time, the emotional erosion settled in. Resentment began to replace pride. Cynicism replaced dedication. He no longer dreamed of distinction. Instead, he drifted, increasingly certain the agency would never truly reward him, never truly value him, never elevate him to the level he believed he deserved. The CIA had become routine. His work had become background noise. And slowly, dangerously, Ames stopped caring. Not just about the job, but about the consequences of failing it. When Rosario entered Aldrich Ames's life, she didn't do so quietly. She arrived like a spark in a room soaked in gasoline. She was everything he wasn't. Vibrant, confident, magnetic, and unapologetically drawn to the finer things in life. Where Ames felt overlooked, she admired him. Where he felt insignificant, she made him feel important. For a man whose career had become a slow descent into disappointment, Rosario represented energy, validation, and escape. She flattered him, believed in him, and perhaps most dangerously, expected a lifestyle far beyond what a mid-level CIA salary could reasonably provide. Their relationship gave Ames something intoxicating: pride. He wasn't just a tired intelligence officer anymore. He was desirable. He was impressive. He was a man capable of providing. At least that's what he desperately wanted to believe. Rosario loved fashion, luxury, and the image of success. Designer clothes, expensive restaurants, and social circles built on appearances quickly became the norm. For Ames, who had long lived in a world of frustration and quiet bitterness, this felt like proof that life still owed him something. He finally had someone who saw him as extraordinary, and he wasn't about to let reality take that away. But reality always arrives. Debt crept in. Divorce obligations drained his finances. Rosario's expectations didn't soften, and Ames's pride wouldn't allow him to admit he couldn't sustain the life he had created. Instead, pressure mounted. Every month, every purchase, every show of wealth dug the hole deeper. He watched colleagues climb ranks and receive recognition while he drowned silently under financial strain. The resentment that had been quietly festering now mixed with desperation. The man who once drifted through his career in apathetic disappointment now faced something far more dangerous: the fear of losing the only thing that made him feel alive and important. Greed wasn't merely the lust for money. It was the hunger to preserve validation. Pride wasn't just vanity. It was a refusal to return to insignificance. And insecurity sat underneath it all, whispering that without this illusion of success, he was nothing. That was the emotional storm building inside Aldrich Ames, a storm that would soon push him toward a decision from which there would be no return. It happened quietly, not in a shadowy alley, not in a dramatic midnight exchange. It happened in daylight, with a drink in his hand and a decision forming in the back of his mind like a stain spreading across clean fabric. Aldrich Ames had spent months drowning in financial pressure, pride, and the illusion of control. Eventually, impulsive thoughts hardened into intent. On April 16, 1985, he did something that would alter the course of American intelligence forever. He walked toward the very enemy he had sworn to fight. And this is the point where his story turns from tragedy into catastrophe. What makes this moment chilling is its simplicity. No one forced him. No blackmail, no coercion, no ideological awakening. Just a man who decided money mattered more than loyalty. He arranged to meet a Soviet diplomat, then changed course when the meeting didn't happen. Fueled by alcohol and desperation, he crossed the street to the Soviet embassy, an action that, for anyone in his position, was the clearest line you could ever cross, and he crossed it willingly. He handed over an envelope. Inside that envelope wasn't just paper. It was trust. It was lives. It was the future of U.S. intelligence operations. The letter identified him, proved he was real, and casually requested $50,000 in return for what he promised he could deliver. The arrogance of it was breathtaking. He knew who he was, he knew what he had access to, and he knew exactly how much it was worth. In that moment, Ames transformed. He was no longer a frustrated bureaucrat lost in mediocrity. He was valuable. He was wanted. The KGB didn't hesitate. They recognized the gold mine standing in front of them. Meetings followed. Money flowed. Satisfaction replaced panic. What he expected to feel as fear arrived instead as relief. Crossing the line didn't feel like treason. It felt like opportunity. But this was not a victimless transaction. Names were about to be handed over. Lives were about to be shattered. Trust was about to dissolve. The CIA had unknowingly just birthed its most destructive internal enemy. With one envelope, one impulsive walk, and one staggering act of betrayal, Aldrich Ames stepped into history. Not as a hero or a misunderstood idealist, but as a man who sold his country for comfort and convinced himself it was worth it. Once the first barrier was broken, everything moved frighteningly fast. What began as a desperate financial lifeline quickly evolved into something far darker, more intoxicating, and infinitely more destructive. Aldrich Ames didn't just pass along fragments of information. He began feeding the KGB the very lifeblood of American intelligence operations. Names of double agents, details of covert missions, the identities of men who had risked everything to spy for the United States. One by one, he handed them over, calmly, deliberately, and without hesitation. The consequences were immediate and brutal. Inside the Soviet Union and across Eastern Europe, trusted American assets vanished almost overnight. People who had worked with U.S. intelligence suddenly stopped communicating. Others were quietly arrested. Some were interrogated. Many were executed. These weren't faceless shadows in a spy novel. They were fathers, husbands, and patriots who believed in something greater than themselves. And with each life destroyed, Ames pocketed another payment, poured another drink, and told himself he simply deserved the reward. What shocked investigators years later was not just the scope of the damage, but the speed of it. Entire networks collapsed. Operations years in the making evaporated. The CIA watched in disbelief as their pipeline of Soviet intelligence abruptly died. They searched for explanations in technology failures, compromised equipment, and imagined external sabotage, anything but the truth. The possibility that one of their own, someone inside the building, someone they trusted, was calmly dismantling US intelligence from the inside was too humiliating to accept. For Ames, the fear of getting caught gradually faded, replaced by something even more dangerous: confidence. The meetings with his handlers, the bundles of cash, the sense of superiority, these didn't feel like treason anymore. They felt like triumph. He wasn't the overlooked officer anymore. He was the man at the center of everything, capable of rewriting the fate of nations with a piece of paper and a signature. Ego blended with greed. Adrenaline replaced conscience. He convinced himself that this was control, that this was power, that this was finally the acknowledgement he'd never received from the CIA. Every name he handed over tightened the Soviet grip and loosened America's. Piece by piece, he sold out his country. And with every life destroyed, Aldrich Ames slipped further into a role he would never escape. Not simply a spy, but the architect of one of the most catastrophic betrayals in US intelligence history. Inside the CIA, confusion slowly turned into dread. Something was terribly wrong. There was no denying that anymore. Trusted Soviet assets were vanishing at an alarming rate, entire operations were collapsing, and years of painstaking intelligence work were suddenly worthless. Reports stopped, contacts disappeared. Agents who had quietly risked everything for the United States were being arrested, interrogated, or simply erased. The agency knew it was facing a catastrophic breach. What it refused to accept was the most obvious explanation. The threat wasn't outside. It was sitting at a desk, collecting a paycheck, and greeting colleagues in the hallway every morning. Instead of looking inward, the CIA searched everywhere else. They blamed compromised communications. They blamed technical failures. They blamed Soviet counterintelligence breakthroughs. Anything but the possibility that an American officer had been calmly feeding their enemies for years. Pride played a cruel role. The CIA had always seen itself as the world's premier intelligence organization. To admit that someone inside their fortress had hollowed it out from within was almost unthinkable. Committees formed, investigations were launched, files were reviewed. Yet they kept circling around the truth without daring to confront it. Leads drifted into dead ends, and suspicion lingered without direction. Meanwhile, paranoia seeped through the corridors. Officers wondered who they could trust. Whispered conversations replaced confidence. Every failure felt like a ghost in the system, a haunting presence they couldn't identify. Ames watched it all unfold with astonishing calm. While lives were being destroyed because of him, he walked freely through CIA headquarters, still attending meetings, still pretending loyalty, still cashing Soviet payments. He remained invisible not because he was a master of deception, but because the CIA simply did not want someone like him to be the answer. He was too familiar, too ordinary, too deeply embedded into the machinery to be considered a threat. Years slipped away, like sand through open fingers. The damage grew while the agency convinced itself the danger must be elsewhere. And in that denial, in that refusal to believe one of their own could have betrayed them so profoundly, Aldrich Ames thrived. The greatest enemy of American intelligence wasn't just a Soviet mole. It was the CIA's own pride, blinding it while its world quietly burned from the inside. What makes the story of Aldrich Ames almost surreal is not just the scale of his betrayal, but the astonishing laziness with which he concealed it. He wasn't a ghost in the system. He wasn't a master of disguise, vanishing into shadows and covering his tracks with flawless tradecraft. He was loud. He was obvious. He was reckless. And for years, it didn't matter. While CIA officers lived modestly on government salaries, Ames suddenly transformed his life into something resembling a wealthy businessman or foreign diplomat. He bought a luxurious home in an affluent neighborhood and paid for it in cash. He drove a Jaguar. He wore expensive suits. He remodeled his house with a level of extravagance that bordered on ridiculous. It wasn't quiet success. It was a billboard announcing something was terribly wrong. Inside the CIA, people whispered. Colleagues exchanged glances. Some joked about his supposed Colombian family fortune. Others rolled their eyes at the story he repeated every time someone dared question how a mid-level intelligence officer was financing a lifestyle beyond his pay grade. Behind closed doors, suspicion grew. No one in his position made that kind of money. No one with his mediocre evaluations suddenly became that comfortable. Yet despite raised eyebrows and hushed conversations, nothing happened. Even his behavior in the office was sloppy. He took calls from Soviet contacts in places he shouldn't have. He left safes improperly secured. He was frequently drunk, frequently unmotivated, and frequently dismissive of rules meant to protect national security. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't sophisticated. It was arrogance. He believed he was untouchable. Worse, for a very long time, he was right. For the CIA, this reality was humiliating. Their most catastrophic mole wasn't a genius manipulator or an elite operative playing a perfect long game. He was an average officer with a drinking problem, an ego, and a taste for luxury. He didn't outsmart them with brilliance. He survived because the agency failed to see what was right in front of it. The embarrassment wasn't just that he betrayed America. It was that he barely tried to hide it, and yet somehow, he continued to get away with everything. Eventually, denial gave way to something far more determined. New minds entered the investigation. People who weren't weighed down by pride, personal bias, or the need to protect institutional ego. They didn't start with excuses. They started with math. Someone inside the CIA was being paid far more than their government salary could ever justify. And money, unlike secrets, rarely lies. Financial analysts began digging into bank records, mortgage payments, luxury purchases, unexplained deposits, and international transfers. As they followed the trail, one name kept rising through the noise like a siren. Aldrich Ames. From that moment, the tone of the hunt changed. Theories became targets. Suspicion became evidence. Ames's life was placed under a microscope. The FBI and CIA coordinated an operation designed to dismantle his world piece by piece, without him ever realizing the walls were closing. His car was bugged. His trash was examined. His movements were monitored. Wiretaps were placed. Every phone call he made carried weight. Every step he took earned scrutiny. What had once seemed impossible was now chillingly plausible. The friendly colleague in the hallway might be the mole who had destroyed everything. Then came the mailbox signal. Investigators watched as Ames casually placed a chalk mark on a mailbox, an old-school signal to the Russians. It wasn't speculation anymore. It wasn't paranoia or coincidence. It was proof. And so, they waited. Carefully. Patiently. He arranged meetings in Bogota. He continued communicating with his handlers. He still believed he was safe. Still believed he was smarter than the system. Still believed the agency he mocked internally could never truly catch him. Meanwhile, the investigators grew colder, more precise and more certain. Surveillance teams followed him relentlessly, documenting every movement, every questionable interaction, every shadow of deceit. The purpose was no longer to suspect Aldrich Ames. It was to build an unbreakable case, so strong that when it finally came crashing down on him, there would be nowhere left to run, no denials left to make, no lies left to cling to. Years of humiliation, denial, and failure were now being forged into determination. The net wasn't just tightening, it was about to snap shut. And Aldrich Ames, who had once walked so casually into betrayal, had no idea how close his world was to finally collapsing around him. When the end finally came, it didn't arrive in dramatic cinematic fashion with helicopters overhead and armed agents crashing through windows. It came on an ordinary morning, on an ordinary street, with Aldrich Ames climbing into his car believing, as he always had, that he remained untouchable. FBI vehicles suddenly boxed him in. Doors flew open. Agents surrounded him. Before he could even process what was happening, he was pulled from the illusion of safety he'd lived in for nearly a decade. The world's most destructive CIA traitor was, at last, in handcuffs. Moments later, Rosario was arrested as well. The carefully constructed fantasy of wealth, admiration, and security shattered instantly, replaced with the cold reality of federal custody and the weight of years of betrayal crashing down. Shock rippled far beyond the man in the back of a government vehicle. Inside U.S. intelligence agencies, disbelief collided with humiliation. For years, the CIA had convinced itself the enemy was always somewhere else. Now they faced the undeniable truth. One of their own had crippled them from within. Courtroom proceedings made that truth unavoidable. Ames stood before the nation not as a misunderstood patriot or ideological warrior, but as a man who had sold secrets for money. Nothing more noble, nothing more complicated. He pleaded guilty. Rosario received prison time of her own. The department Ames once served now spoke his name with anger and shame. Then came the tally. Intelligence analysts and government officials began counting the cost, and the numbers were devastating. At least 10 U.S. assets were believed to have been executed as a direct result of Ames's betrayal. Many more disappeared into prisons or simply ceased to exist in the shadows of Soviet justice. Countless operations were compromised. Strategies were exposed. Trust was obliterated. Years of painstaking intelligence work died because one man decided luxury mattered more than human lives. Beyond the tangible damage lay something deeper and more corrosive. Confidence within the CIA was shattered. Careers ended. Faith in internal security collapsed. Lawmakers demanded answers. Investigations exposed complacency, arrogance, and stunning negligence. American intelligence would recover operationally in time, but reputationally, scars remained. Aldrich Ames was sentenced to life in prison, where he still sits. Rosario eventually returned to Colombia after serving her term. But long after courtrooms emptied and headlines faded, the consequences endured. His betrayal was not a moment. It was a wound. A deep, bleeding cut to American intelligence that changed it forever. In the end, the legacy of Aldrich Ames stretches far beyond the staggering number of lives destroyed, beyond the operations crippled, beyond the money exchanged in dark corners and secret meetings. His story forced the United States to confront something deeply uncomfortable. Betrayal doesn't always come wrapped in ideology, revolution, or dramatic symbolism. Sometimes it comes in the form of a tired bureaucrat, a frustrated mid-level officer, a man who stopped caring and decided his comfort mattered more than human life. Ames wasn't driven by political conviction or belief in a different world order. He was driven by greed, pride, resentment, and a desire to feel important in a life that no longer made him feel significant. The question that haunted Washington after his arrest was painfully simple. How could this have been allowed to happen? The answer was not easy to swallow. It wasn't just Ames's deception that doomed U.S. intelligence. It was institutional arrogance. It was a refusal to believe someone inside their own walls could sabotage them so completely. It was bureaucratic blindness, missed warnings, and a culture that punished suspicion more than it rewarded vigilance. In many ways, Ames exposed the CIA as much as he exposed American secrets. He revealed vulnerabilities not in their technology, but in their trust and their pride. Changes eventually came. Internal security tightened. Financial monitoring became far more aggressive. Counterintelligence procedures grew sharper, harsher, and less forgiving. The CIA had learned a lesson carved in the lives of the people Ames destroyed. Trust without verification is not loyalty. It is a liability. But every reform carried a shadow, a lingering uncertainty that no policy could fully erase. Because the last and most unsettling part of Ames's legacy is the question that still hangs over every intelligence agency in the world. If one man could do this much damage while barely bothering to hide it, how confident can anyone ever be that there isn't another? Someone quieter, smarter, more careful. Someone already in place. Someone smiling in the hallway. Someone trusted. Aldrich Ames remains a monument to betrayal. Not as an anomaly, but as a warning. Not just about what spies can do, but about what happens when those tasked with protecting a nation refuse to believe that the greatest threat may already be standing among them. So let me know in the comments. Do you think Aldrich Ames was a unique disaster? Or do you believe someone like him is still out there today? And if you want more real Cold War spy stories, make sure you're subscribed.